Welcome to the teaching ministry of Lakeside Alliance Church. We are a movement of people who are passionate about pursuing Jesus Christ. If you're in Southeast Wisconsin, join us on a Sunday morning and consider partnering in a mission that matters. For now, sit back and open your heart as we hear from Pastor John.
Thank you for reading this morning as we launch into this series together. We're going to be looking at this letter of 1 Thessalonians, which is written by the Apostle Paul. And as you may have picked up there in that second to last verse, that Paul actually charged the church there to read that letter in its entirety to the whole church that was gathering there in the city. And so as we hear it this morning, though, and we begin to kind of take in and step into this series, hopefully as you're listening to it, you have the chance to be able to catch the vision, catch the heartbeat that Paul has for this church, that he has this longing to see them do well, to endure well. He has a burden and has a loving concern for them as an apostle, that these fellow brothers and sisters in Christ in Thessalonica endure. He has this first in his concern, you can see this, that in this desire that in spite of all the, let me just get situated here. But in spite of all the pressures, right, that they're under, that they follow the examples that they've seen, that they're encouraged to follow the Christ-like examples that they've seen in him. And finally, that they would also take a firm stand in the hope and the joy of knowing the glorious end when Jesus returns, and that they can be entirely certain about that in the face of all of these pressures. That's the heartbeat behind this letter and this just the passion that's being expressed here for these Christians in Thessalonica, but also for those of us in this room today. That same heartbeat, that we would endure, that we would follow great examples that we have, and that we would be certain of Jesus's return. When I think about this heartbeat of this letter, it reminds me of someone in my own life, and part of my journey is being a pastor and having this kind of care and concern for past churches and fellow believers that I've poured my life and my ministry into. And one who comes to mind in particular is a friend of mine named Aaron, Aaron, as we used to call him in school, if you know that joke. Otherwise, don't worry about it. And Aaron and I, we were at college together. I started out as his RA there at school, and then he became a volunteer of mine on the other side of the country, and then eventually my ministry intern. I officiated at his wedding, and we spent a lot of evenings around campfires where iron was sharpening iron. And Aaron was a gifted expositor, and a really gifted businessman too. He eventually ended up running the company that he started out on the ground floor of. However, the business that he was in tended towards causing some struggles in his faith. It was in a geographical area with a culture that was oftentimes even a bit hostile towards Christianity and his faith at times. And on top of that, during the season where we were friends, we were in ministry together and so forth, his parents and his siblings, who were states away and who at one time were known for having just a very solid faith and vibrant faith, it completely came apart. Their marriage melted down, and just the family was a mess. In the midst of some of these trials that he was under and going through, I was called away to another church. And knowing what was going on in his world, when I would call him up occasionally, I would have this feeling while the phone was ringing of concern, of just wonder. Is he enduring? Is he enduring well? Is his faith intact? Is it more than just, checking the box? Is he going to have something to show for it at the end? And to know that all the time that we had spent and invested, that it wouldn't have been for waste. And every time, including this last year where I got to see him and his family, I would experience this relief when we'd reconnect of hearing and seeing evidence in his life that, this guy was hanging in there. And in fact, more than that, he was nailing it. Right? His Christ-like values and character at work and home and church, they were shining through in his life. It was making an impact on people around him that was going to matter for eternity. It was encouraging to see. I have little doubt, though, that kind of situation, in one way or another, is something that you can relate to as well. It's a reflection of 1 Thessalonians. When we think about that kind of concern that we have with our kids, maybe our spouse, our friends, and ourselves, when we see that kind of situation, perhaps the relief and the encouragement that we find when we find out that, they're doing good. They're hanging in there. It's a joy with it. Other times, of course, that there's a sorrow when we don't see that. And of course, there's a challenge in our own lives to endure. We know, and perhaps sometimes all too well, as the founder of the Salvation Army, William Booth, once really aptly put it, that the tendency of fire is to go out. So watch the fire on the altar of your heart. Anyone who's tended a fireplace knows that it needs to be stirred up occasionally. And church, 1 Thessalonians offers us this kind of stirring in our life and in our hearts when it comes to our faith. And so as we begin to work our way through this series, I want to start by just giving us some broad brushstrokes for the background color for this letter. And so I want to do that this morning by lightly touching on the context and the vision behind it. So let's go ahead, let's look at the context here first. In verse 1 of that letter, we get a basic who's who going on here. We see it's from Paul. Many of your translations probably say Silvanus and Timothy. As we look at this letter, as we look at the second letter to the Thessalonians, and as we look at the book of Acts, we begin to see a real clear picture of who's who and what that really means, and this place that they're writing to. As we pull these things together, we find that Paul is Saul of Tarsus's Greek name. We find that Silvanus is Silas's Latin name, and that Timothy is Timothy's only name. And it's that these three are behind this letter. However, as we read this letter carefully, we realize that Paul is being clearly treated as the author of the letter, and that at times he'll wobble between saying I and we. We can see it there. And then even other times when the we is being talked about, it's only talking about Paul and Silas, as they're the ones who came to this city to launch this church. And as we pick up in the letter, and as we see in the book of Acts, we find that when they came to this city, they came physically broken, having been brutally stripped and beaten with long wooden rods, and then illegally imprisoned in Philippi, but where they also were miraculously delivered from that imprisonment. It was in the midst of that kind of challenging condition that they journeyed to Thessalonica. This is a city at the time of about 200,000 people. It was a thriving and free port city, the province of Macedonia in modern-day Greece. It still exists today, in fact. And at the time, it was a city that was filled with all kinds of pagan practices that would actually cause most of us to blush to explain. Although the rampant and lawful sexual, promiscuous, and pagan scene in Thessalonica probably seemed like a daunting challenge to Paul and Silas from the Judea area, they nonetheless took courage. They preached the gospel, and as a result, Many powerful Jewish men, prominent women, and just outright just pagan people embraced the gospel message. It happened within the first 3 weeks of their ministry there. And from that beginning point, Paul worked to brace up this group of Christians against the pushback and the affliction that he saw coming. It's the kind of affliction that he and Silas knew only too well. And when it eventually hit, it hit like a tidal wave over these Christians. There was a riot that was stirred up in Thessalonica against them. And in that city, the Christians then were injured and extorted. And the scene is so turbulent that Paul and Silas were sent away in order to kind of pull out the lightning rod out of the midst of this new church. And while this helped, there was still financial and political persecution and potentially even martyrdom that followed in Thessalonica. All of which provides us then with a very colorful backdrop as we look at this letter from Paul. And you can then understand why he's so concerned about finding out how they're doing and the relief that he experiences in learning that in spite of the mounting pressure, this church was enduring. They were even more than enduring. They were doing well. They had watched Paul's example. They had known of Christ's example. They had read of the Old Testament prophets and their example, and they were choosing to hang in there. And what I want us to learn from this colorful background is that Christian endurance is never a given. Christian endurance is never a given. You know, the Bible actually never treats our endurance as something that's just going to happen. Kind of like magically happen. In fact, it warns us away from making those kinds of assumptions. Rather, it's treated like in chapter 2, verse 11. It's treated like this. For you know how like a father with his children, talking about Paul here, we exhorted each one of you and encouraged you and charged you to walk in a manner worthy of God, who calls you, right, into his own kingdom and glory. Christian endurance is never a given. Instead, you and I are called to live in the tension where we are persevering and where Christ is preserving us. We give our best knowing that God's got the rest. We work in love and faith, but also in the steadfast hope that Jesus is upholding us. Some of you are familiar perhaps with the concept of God's sovereignty and man's responsibility. As we work our way through this letter, you're going to see that tension, that same tension, brought to bear again and again with how we live out our lives as Christians in this world and in this pressurized environment. And the context of this letter helps really to flush that out into reality and to see it shining through. And so as a church, we actually have a way of talking about this around here. Some of you are familiar with it if you've gone through our partnership process here at Lakeside, but it's called our B process, as in B period, E period process, where we look at to work out our vision of helping people passionately pursue Jesus Christ. And we want to do that together, and we think about how that applies individually. And one of the pieces in that process that we talk about then is the importance of internalizing the truth where we are being assured by Jesus' righteousness. We're being assured by Jesus' righteousness. And that from there, as we embrace that truth, that Jesus has got us, that he has offered up a perfect record in our place, that we know that there's no hope if that's not true, that then that truth propels us forward in action as we endure in the way of the gospel, where we work out our faith in daily life. It's one of the ways that we apply this truth. These two are tied together. And real practically, as we think about this in our life, what it should shape for us is an outlook where we are realistically optimistic. We are realistically optimistic about our faith. The context of this book, it shows us that Christian endurance, it's not a given. It shouldn't be treated that way. But a Christian should be realistically optimistic in their outlook. We should look at life knowing that a Christian in our society, it's going to be costly. It's going to require some hard work. But that we are also confident and assured that our home in heaven, it isn't up for grabs. Our eternity is secure. And Christ's return is going to bring about justice, going to bring about new heavens and new earth, and all of that is certain. Both of these are true, and it forms an outlook where we are realistically optimistic. In a sense, the Apostle Paul then coined the original Stockdale paradox. Some of you may be familiar with this reference to Admiral Jim Stockdale. He's the highest ranking United States military member of the Hanoi Hilton prisoner of war camp in the Vietnam War. In an interview with Jim Collins, Stockdale discussed how he survived his lengthy and brutal imprisonment in that camp. And he went on to talk about how he never lost faith that he was going to get out of there, but that he also wasn't a simple optimist. He said this, he said, the optimists were the ones who said, we're going to be out by Christmas. And Christmas would come and Christmas would go. And then they say, we're going to be out by Easter. And Easter would come and Easter would go. And then Thanksgiving. And then it would be Christmas again. And they died of a broken heart. He went on to say this. He said, this is a very important lesson. You must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be. Church, 1 Thessalonians, it carries that kind of message to us. And church, in our world around us, it is going to likely become increasingly difficult and increasingly hostile to our faith. You and I are going to have to deal with it. We're going to have to deal with it. But to deal with it in a way and with an attitude that is realistically optimistic, where we have a confident assurance in Christ and a commitment to working hard and enduring in our faith well. This series is going to drive that truth home as we work through 1 Thessalonians. And it also flows, though, right into my hope for us as we go through sharing this series. Paul had a vision behind this book that we want to share in, a particular vision. And as we study this letter, we're going to find that, 4 times Paul talks about encouraging, 3 times he talks about urging, twice he talks about exhorting, and on top of all those, he talks about warning, admonishing, asking, instructing, and establishing. Church, Paul's vision for this letter is like a coach, right? His hope for the Thessalonians in their difficult situation was to keep them from resting on their laurels so they could stand firm. He knew that if they were going to endure in this challenge, they needed a vision to carry out their faith in the midst of the challenge. Paul knew that Christian endurance, it takes work. It's not a given, is it? It's not a given. As an old mentor of mine, Dave Hale, used to play for the Chicago Bears. He once really impressed on me this reality when he said this. He said that in the Christian life, there's no sitting down. You're either moving forward or you're moving backwards. But in this life, there's no standing still. Paul's point in this urging, encouraging, admonishing, and more was to call Christians to live according to a right example. It wasn't just get busy, it was live in this direction. There's a very active sense throughout this letter where it offers a vision of a Christian endurance that requires an example to live out. Friends, we need to look to the examples of men and women who are following in Christ's example. That's the direction that we need to head in. It's towards Jesus. He is the final example that we need to look to. We want to endure in the pressures that we're under, whether those are emotional, whether those are physical, whether those are mental, financial, relational, or maybe spiritual, or all the above. If we want to endure, we need these examples. And like Paul, part of my job, as scary as it is sometimes, is to model that and to try to call you towards that kind of character. I don't do either of those perfectly, but in any way that my life reflects Jesus's, I hope that it serves as a model for you, as an example. In any way that my teaching and my counseling can unearth biblical texts for you, I hope it encourages you. Not in the sense of just kind of like endless pats on the back, but in a very even-handed sense that says, listen, if you're doing well, great job. Christ's words of well done, good and faithful servant. That's what we want to hear. If you're not doing well, I hope you hear it as a call to get up, right? Not stay down. There's hope and there's a way forward because of Jesus. But friends, that's not just the case for me. That's the case for us. It's not just the case for Paul and the Thessalonians. That's the case for us. Almost half of the calls to encourage or admonish and so forth in this letter, it's from one another. It's not just Paul and pastors who are to model and to call others towards an example and towards endurance in our faith, to live in alignment with the gospel. It's actually for one another. It's our job to do this together. It's your job. It's part of our role in the lives of one another, to call and to encourage one another, to help model, teach, and to take responsibility for helping one another to endure. As we go about doing that, we want to start with those closest to us, because we don't want to be a hypocrite about it, right? We don't want to be faking it, but we want to do so slowly, honestly, faithfully, and biblically. And this is a great application for any one of us when we see the vision behind this letter that Paul had for the church there. And if you're wondering what that might look like just practically in your own life, here's a couple of examples. First of all, if your spouse perhaps is maybe facing some real challenges, it's just taking the time in those moments just to pause and to pray with them about those problems. Not skipping over it, but modeling that, leading the way in doing that together. Second, if you've got maybe a teenager who is irritable and struggling in their own ways, it's taking the time to pause. Maybe, for a couple of weeks, whether it's on a Saturday or Sunday, just going out for an hour. I don't know, maybe you get ice cream, I don't know. But you just take time to be able to listen to them if they're a talker and talk to them if they're a strong silent type. And then pray with them at the end. That's an easy way to be able to model this and to be able to put it into action. If you're the one who's struggling yourself, tell someone, right? I know this is not a novel idea, but tell someone. It's a humble choice. Let them pray for you. You don't have to overshare and you don't have to expect them to carry all your emotional baggage either. But let them love on you a bit. Because Lakeside, isn't that what we want for one another? We want to see one another endure. And not just endure, but to endure well. That's the vision for this letter. And for us as a church. And it is a relief and it is a great joy when we see that happening. And we want to experience that joy together as a church family. We want to look at each other's lives and be able to say, they're rocking it, right? They're killing it. They're nailing it. They're making an impact for eternity. Man, she's got a great example. Her testimony's intact. That guy's talking to people. He's sharing his faith. We want to be able to celebrate that with one another and to continue to encourage that in one another, whether it's hard or it's easy. We want to help one another pursue Jesus Christ passionately. We want to do that together. And this series, church, my hope is that it unleashes us to do that well with one another as a church as we continue to look again and again to Christ's example in our life and the lives of those around us.